Hey everyone, welcome to the Them Before Us podcast, our special series, What Happens When IVF Becomes a Right. And today we're joined, as usual, by patient Sunny, who is our engagement director. I'm Jen Friesen, our training director for Them Before Us. And we are joined also today, a special guest, Dr. Craig Turczynski. He is a cradle Catholic who completed a BS in animal science at Iowa State University. He has a PhD in physiology of reproduction at Texas A&M University and a postdoctoral fellowship in reproductive endocrinology at the Women's Research Institute in Wichita, Kansas. He became assistant professor of OBGYN at Louisiana State University Medical School, Shreveport, where he developed and directed their clinical hormone, andrology, and IVF laboratories. After 7 years, he quit doing IVF due to conflicts with the aggressive, life-denying use of the technology. He then experienced a reversion to his faith and found work in medical sales and business. Since 2018, he's been rekindling his clinical science career in the field of restorative reproductive medicine by working with leaders in this developing field, including the Billings ovulation method, My Catholic Doctor, FEMM, and Neo-Fertility. He also completed the certification course in healthcare bioethics from NCBC. Married since 1989 to his wife, Rosa, they live on a small farm and have 3 grown children and 3 grandchildren. Dr. Turczynski, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Jennifer and Patience. It's a pleasure to meet both of you and to be part of your podcast.
We're so happy. I mean, you have such incredible experience. Even I was reading part of your bio, experience doing some of these technologies with animals, which is really fascinating. Maybe we'll get into it, but we'd love to just hear a little bit about your background just from you versus reading it on the bio, and what brought you to where you are today?
Yeah, so I was always fascinated with nature and biology, and when I was about 12 years old, my family moved us from a suburb of Chicago to a small town in Iowa and a farm, and I just thrived in that environment. I loved having animals, taking care of animals. We had everything from baby pigs to cattle and sheep and everything in between, and I really loved that. Also had 136 acres to roam around on, hunt, and drive my 3-wheeler. So I went to Iowa State and did a degree in animal science. And when I graduated, my first job was actually being a artificial insemination technician for farmers around a couple counties. So I used to drive around the counties, and the farmers would call you up and you would go out there with bull semen frozen in the back and do artificial insemination. That's how I know the term AI. We used to use AI back before it's what it's called today. But after I did that for a while, I decided I wanted to go back to school. I wanted to go somewhere warm. I chose Texas, and I needed to work for about a year to establish my residency. So I actually got a job at the Dallas Zoo. And while I was there, I met Dr. Dwayne Kramer and many of his graduate students who were actually at the time doing a project trying to collect embryos from giraffe. So they were applying all kinds of reproductive technology to both domestic and exotic animals, the idea being trying to preserve and propagate endangered species. And so it was a very fun time in my life.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah. So after graduating with a PhD, I then took a postdoctoral fellowship. At that point, I was married, had 1 child, another on the way, and of course, money was important to us. And I knew about human in vitro fertilization. I knew it was a more lucrative career. I didn't think there was any conflicts with it at the time. And so the postdoctoral fellowship that I did in Wichita was to basically adapt all of my knowledge and techniques to human IVF. So I spent almost 2 years there doing NIH-funded research and working in their clinical IVF lab. And then I took my first faculty position at LSU Medical Center in Shreveport, where I directed their laboratories. I practiced doing that for a total of about 7 years. And it was during that time that I began to question what I was doing, seeing some of the harm and disorder that was caused. At the time, we were able to help maybe 1 out of 4. So 1 out of 4 couples that came to us would leave. But if you're successful from it, you might feel it was worth it. But 3/4 of the people went through a significant amount of trauma, especially the trauma that might happen when you get pregnant and you lose the pregnancy, either through miscarriage or ectopic pregnancy. So it's very traumatic. And it just didn't seem right. There was something that didn't seem right to me. I wasn't comfortable with it. There was a final event that occurred. If you want to ask me about that, I'll share it. But basically, I decided I needed to leave, and I just needed to find work, and so I found work in medical device and did that for the next 20 years.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. So this episode, we're kicking off a series that's doing a deep dive on IVF. It's been in the news a lot. A lot of people who didn't really know a lot about it feel the need to take a position on it right now. And so we're working on equipping our audience on this topic, helping them really understand what goes on in IVF. So can you just walk our audience through how does IVF work? What is the process that goes on?
Okay.
The term gets thrown around, but I think we often don't understand all of the details of what
Yeah,
happens there.
right. Yeah. So IVF obviously stands for in vitro fertilization. In a general sense, it's the conventional, the most well-known method of helping couples treat infertility. It's a very powerful technology that it's technical. It's taking gametes out and out of the body and allowing the fertilization process to occur, and then culturing those embryos until usually now day 5, so culturing them for 5 days, and then selecting the prettiest embryos and the ones that are thought to be the healthiest for transfer, usually now 1 or 2, and then the remaining ones would either be frozen or they could be discarded. A couple things I would like to point out for your podcast listeners is, so first of all, I feel sometimes I have to apologize because I will many times use the terms that are typically used in the field. I'm a scientist. I approach it from a science perspective, but I also use it for emphasis. But I want to apologize to some listeners that may have experienced IVF, may have been born through IVF, that my goal is not to hurt them. I do believe that people who have infertility deserve to have treatment that helps to relieve that suffering. It's a great burden. And those that have used IVF, or even more so, those that have been born through IVF, are beautiful people with dignity and deserve nothing but love and respect. So I do want to share those things with everybody. IVF doesn't require that the health of the individual be assessed. And there could be a wide range of pre-diagnostic work done prior to being to moving forward with IVF. And in my opinion, we often move, both the patients and the physicians move way too fast to IVF without really trying to understand the diagnosis. In fact, the diagnosis is not even necessary because you will get the same treatment regardless of what your, recurrent miscarriage, PCOS, thyroid disease, and any ailment that could be affecting infertility. You're going to get IVF.
Yeah, thank you. Um, what are the risks to the embryos during the IVF process?
Yeah, so there's risk to both the mother and the potential offspring. It's important to understand that IVF itself is not therapeutic for the woman. It's kind of like chemotherapy, right? That it's not pleasant by any means, but you believe it's worth it to go through this process for the hope of a good um, result. And it is actually downright hostile to the embryos because it sets up a the way it works best is if you set up a kind of a survival of the fittest, a sort of a Hunger Games for the embryo, so that you can choose the most healthy embryo, and then you end up with excess embryos, what we call surplus embryos. Of course, these terms do not provide any dignity to the embryonic person that it may have been conceived that way. And so that process, because you don't necessarily have to do anything to make sure that the parents are healthy, that can result in adverse pregnancy events for the mother. So increased incidence of gestational diabetes, hypertension, placental issues, and for the offspring, increased congenital abnormalities, 30 to 40% increased chance of congenital abnormalities. And there is also the potential for what we call epigenetic changes to the embryo. So these are not changes to the genes themselves, but how the genes are activated. It's another term for it is imprinting. Something happens during the process, could be related to the health of the individuals, but it also appears to be related to the supraovulatory process. When I talked about how the gametes are collected, the woman is typically stimulated with hormones or artificially drive the ovulatory mechanism, so you have multiple eggs that mature 10 to 20. The woman is under very high levels of hormones during that time. There's evidence that can impact the offspring. And then the embryo culture itself can also impact the embryo in some way. Despite the fact that we made major improvements in how we can culture embryos, it's not nearly a replacement for the natural maternal environment. So there are metabolic issues that can occur to the embryo that then impact those offspring, those IVF conceived persons later in life.
Can I ask you, and this is like a very layperson question, but I'm just thinking that even in a few years of working for them before us, and we talk about IVF quite a bit, I actually don't really understand what you, as the scientist that has an egg and a sperm, actually does. Is it because in nature, isn't it like millions of sperm are trying to get toward the egg? And then I know over the course of, it's like a gauntlet, right? And then only the fittest survive kind of thing. But when it's the lab, you've kind of tried to go through and choose what you think is the best egg and choose what you think is the best sperm. But these are microscopic, so you have to look through, can you just describe really in like layman's terms what you actually have to do to make an embryo?
Good question. And I will say that it's actually quite incredible what man has been able to do in this process and how it's developed over time. And if you think about it from just a scientific perspective, it's amazing. But so the physician is managing the patient. They're stimulating the woman to produce multiple eggs. Usually, maybe some additional health-related things might be done. Maybe it won't be done, like supplements or healthy diet or things like that, right? Or treating if somebody has hypothyroidism. Maybe those things might be getting treated, but it's not. It may not be getting done. But once the patient has a group of mature follicles, they'll be taken into a procedure room, and the eggs will be aspirated with a long needle that goes through the vagina into the individual follicles, and the contents are sucked out. They're sucked out into a tube, and at that point, the tube is handed to the embryologist. The embryologist then puts that under the microscope, gathers all the eggs from those from that retrieval, and then puts them into culture. These are culture dishes that have been prepared usually the night before. So all those eggs now are put into very tiny drops of liquid medium and then covered with a kind of an oil overlay that helps there from being any evaporation. The man is then solicited, usually encouraged to collect sperm through masturbation, but in cases where the man might not have sperm in his ejaculate, the sperm could be retrieved surgically, either through a testicular biopsy or aspirating the epididymis. Once you have the sperm and the eggs, the sperm have been washed. They have been prepared. You then put the eggs and the sperm together. The embryologist would do that, and most of the time, the egg would be fertilized with, say, about 100,000 sperm or so. So the number of sperm are titrated down to mix with the egg. So about, let's just give or take 100,000 sperm, and then fertilization would occur naturally. But in a subset of men who have male factor, if there's any question whatsoever that the man has the ability to fertilize the egg, the embryologist will actually, under the microscope, pick up one individual sperm cell and inject it directly into the egg. That technology was developed around the early to mid 1990s, and it revolutionized the use of IVF for male factor, but it also inhibited any further study into what was causing male infertility to begin with. Because we didn't know how to treat it, the thought was, well, let's just do ICSI because we know we can get fertilization with that. So depending on how that insemination takes place, then the next morning, the embryologist comes in and checks for fertilization. There's a very short window of time when you can tell whether the embryo has been fertilized normally by the presence of two pronuclei, one from the egg, one from the sperm. And anything that doesn't have just two pronuclei would be considered non-viable and discarded. Those embryos are then placed into fresh culture medium and they're cultured for up to about 5 days. During that culture period of time, they may be taken out of the incubator and looked and observed under the microscope. And you're looking at their development. Today, there's getting to be more and more use of artificial intelligence, as well as um, videography to put those embryos under constant observation, and then AI choosing what embryo appears to be the healthiest. So during that period of time, it should divide appropriately. By day 5, it has begun its first differentiation process where it forms the trophectoderm that becomes primarily the extraembryonic membranes, and then the inner cell mass that's mostly the fetus, but also some extra embryonic membranes. And so that is the stage that the transfer would occur. At that point, the embryologist is going to grade and select the what they believe to be the most viable embryo. 1 or 2 embryos are typically transferred. That was a correction the field took from the earlier practice of transferring 3 to 5 embryos that resulted in multiples and a lot of health consequences to that for both the mother and the offspring. But now it's 1 or 2 of those embryos will then be transferred back. So in addition to the ICSI procedure that I described, where the sperm are injected directly into the egg, there are a number of add-ons that can be done as well. For instance, assisted hatching is when a laser or a small amount of acidic media will be used to dissolve away part of that protein covering. When if anybody has looked at an embryo, they see that round coating around the embryo. The embryo has to hatch out of that before it can implant. So sometimes assisted hatching is done where a part of that protein cover is dissolved away. And then, of course, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis can also be done where the embryologist will go in and pull, say, 2 or 3 cells off of the embryo. The embryo will then be frozen while they genetically analyze those cells to see, is there any genetic abnormality in the form of chromosomes, normal chromosomes, or it could be as far as wanting to know the eye color of the baby. So that's a common procedure, and so that's well, of course, any of the extra embryos, the largest majority of them are usually frozen, so called cryopreservation. And so those embryos are subject to first dehydration. They have to be dehydrated so they don't have water content that would cause ice to form inside of the embryo. So they're dehydrated and then subjected to freezing at extremely high temperatures, liquid nitrogen. Liquid nitrogen is minus 196 degrees Celsius. That's what they're then stored in for an indefinite period of time.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was so much information there. What happens to the embryos that aren't ultimately transferred? What is their fate? And I believe that that contributed to your decision to leave the IVF industry. Can you say a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So most of the time, the excess, again, using language of the field, the excess embryos are cryopreserved. The couple, of course, has really very little understanding the consequences. To comprehend that decision is very, very difficult. But it's a way to defer. It's a way to defer the decision of what to do with those embryos until later. So most of them are frozen. But in some cases, the patient may decide to simply discard those embryos. That was the final kind of event that occurred in my career that really solidified the fact that I couldn't continue doing this. When everything I was doing was at least designed to try to produce a child, to produce life. It was inconceivable to me that a couple could just say, I want these 2 embryos, throw the rest away, when there's so many others that can't even, that are suffering and can't conceive and aren't successful. It was just inconceivable to me. I objected to it. The physician who was my superior, I reported to in an academic position, made it very clear that that if I didn't do it, my job was at stake. I caved, and I did what the patient desired, and allowed those embryos to basically continue to culture until they died. So our technology is only good for up to maybe 5 to 7 days of embryo development. After that, we don't know really how to culture these embryos. And so they will eventually, out of neglect, die. And that's what happened in this case. So patients can decide immediately upon finishing that retrieval, getting the embryos they want transferred, discard the rest. Or they can donate them to research. Any research is going to be destructive research to the embryo. And that research, of course, could range from everything from a new embryologist practicing in the lab to an NIH multi-center trial. And a lot of things can happen in the laboratory that nobody really knows about. It's very easy for that to happen. And so there are, of course, a few other options. The field uses a term called compassionate transfer. Compassionate transfer would be the use or the transfer of frozen embryos during a time where it is virtually impossible for them to implant. I don't know how that's compassionate, but that's the term that they use, in the American Society for Reproductive Medicine indicates that that's a moral and ethical approach. Another option could be embryo adoption, and in this case, the embryos are donated. They can do this as an open adoption, or they can do it anonymously. They give up their embryos. They're no longer they no longer own them. Now the program owns them, and then couples can adopt them and have them transferred. There's one other potential option, and that is perpetual storage of the embryos. And while that may not seem like much of an option for the embryo itself, and in that case, the couple would need to set up some kind of a trust so that the storage fees would be covered indefinitely. There's an organization called Sacred Heart Guardians in Shelter, and Laura Elm is the founder of that organization. I serve on the board actually, and we've begun to discuss what it might take to create a sanctuary where couples can choose the option of perpetual storage. As I mentioned, it may not seem like an option for those embryos. They will never have a chance to be born. But if you're a Christian and you believe in heaven, and you believe that our ultimate destination is heaven, then those embryos can be stored until our Savior comes back and he will then make all things right.
We're going to have Laura Elm on our podcast actually
Wonderful.
coming up. So that'll
Yeah,
be
great.
yeah, that'll be great. I've met with her, and that's a great ministry that I had not, considered before meeting her and hearing about it.
Right. As you know, Sacred Heart's primary focus right now is providing a sacred burial for embryos that die
Right.
in the laboratory, as opposed to simply discarding them in medical ways.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's a beautiful thing that they're offering families for sure. Catholics have gotten the reproductive technologies right for the most part. We've been saying on our organization, the Protestants have been maybe a little slower to get on board, and we really got caught. We, meaning more conservatives and a lot of Christians, seem to have gotten caught really flat-footed when IVF really hit the news with the Alabama decision that happened. And we had politicians who are pretty solidly pro-life getting cornered on MSNBC and being asked, wait, I thought you thought life began at conception, and really being called out for sort of that inconsistency.
Right.
So what do you think, Trump, because of that, I think a lot of conservatives, and because conservatives were getting attacked, they're going to come and ban abortion and they're going to ban IVF.
Yeah.
And Katie Faust likes to say, well, these are kind of two sides of the same kind of coin. Embryos, human beings are dying, even though in one case we really, really want them. And in the other case, we're deciding we don't. These are really two sides of the same coin. And I think, responding to that, a lot of conservatives, including Trump, immediately said, no, we're going to make sure we federally fund it. We're going to protect your right to IVF. We're going to make sure insurance companies fund it. And, I don't know how serious that was, or is that just kind of a bunch of people saying a bunch of stuff to try and not get attacked?
Right.
But what do you think pro-lifers, people who would vote pro-life and vote pretty conservatively, what are the things we should know when it comes to IVF and when it comes to, should we oppose federal legislation? Should we talk to our state legislators and try to inform them of some different things? What advice would you give folks when we consider it?
Yeah, great question. Well, that it is true that IVF is about helping people bring new lives into the world. It's not always in the way that most of us think about it. Most of us think about a young couple who, due to no fault of their own, have trouble conceiving, and that IVF is going to be used to help them have a baby. How wonderful is that? But then there are many other examples that either fall into a gray area or fall into areas that most conservatives would certainly not support. These are things like lifestyle choices, most of them being, as your organization has pointed out, very selfish motivations by the parents, not considering the lives of the children that are born from it. Examples of this would be, say, using surrogacy because it's more convenient. You don't want to carry the baby, and so you hire somebody to carry the baby for you. Donor gametes, or using pre-implantation genetic diagnosis because you want certain genetic traits in your children. Or there seems to be a growing desire to push the limits of procreation outside of the traditional family. Keep in mind that there's no home study. Like for an adoption, there's typically a home study, but for IVF, it's if you can pay the admission fee, you get in, right? So there's really no restrictions on the extent that people will go to have children. There's actually research now recently published from out of China where they've shown that you can produce a genetic offspring from two men. Well, not two men, but two male mice. Okay, we're still a long way from that being able to apply to humans. But there are people in the field that are already kind of discussing that possibility as if it's a good thing. And so the boundaries, without boundaries, the technology will absolutely be abused. And then it's also to point out to pro-family, pro-lifers, is that less than 1 out of every 10 embryos that are produced by IVF ever become a baby. I think it's somewhere between 4 and 6% of the embryos that are produced in vitro ever become a baby. So at least 9 out of every 10 will either die or be subject to indefinite storage. And so you think about it that way, that's really not very pro-life. That's not pro-children if only 1 out of 10 or less than 1 out of 10 ever actually does become a baby.
Yeah, that's really good. And I appreciate you highlighting the child harming aspects of the industry and some of the developments of this technology. We have a couple guests later in the series that are going to talk more about pre-implantation genetic screening, and also you briefly alluded to IVG. We've got an episode on that coming up as well.
Yeah.
So for our listeners, stay tuned for that.
Very important point, because I hope what you'll get into is the fact that pre-implantation genetic diagnosis has been now shown to not necessarily definitively choose what is a viable embryo and what is not. We can get into all that genetics. It's pretty complicated, but the bottom line is, just because your embryo cells that they took out of the embryo show aneuploidy or mosaicism, it doesn't mean the embryo is not viable.
Yeah. Yeah, that is such a good reminder, and something that so many couples navigating this are just not aware of.
Right.
Which kind of gets to my last question here. Infertility is a very real source of heartbreak for so many couples. You know, that's often what draws people to IVF. What would you say to a couple that's been told they should consider IVF or it's their only option? And they're in that position where they're grieving something that they deeply desire, and they don't have.
Yeah. Very, very good question. So I actually deal with couples just like that on a weekly basis. I teach a form of fertility awareness based method. I teach the Billings method, and I also meet with patients on 2 different platforms, telehealth platforms, mostly consulting with the men to help them understand and navigate this fertility. And they very frequently, couples who maybe have kind of thought about IVF and kind of went down that route to consider it, they are frequently told by the practitioners, there's no way you're going to conceive unless you use IVF. And it's such a disservice. Because we have examples, the physicians that I work with on a regular basis have clear examples. There's published examples of how couples who have already experienced failure through IVF are conceiving through restorative reproductive medicine. So in regards to legislation, the very first question that needs to be asked is, has the couple been able to find a medical team that's experienced in restorative reproductive medicine? Because unfortunately, the top gun for infertility, the reproductive endocrinologist, is only typically trained to do IVF. They're hired to do IVF. They have $1 million or more laboratory, and they have a staff of highly paid embryologists. Of course, they're going to push people into IVF. But this restorative reproductive medicine, which very few couples actually know about, is proven to be quite successful in many cases. Not all. Now, there are scenarios where we don't have the knowledge to be able to fix those, but that's also because we've abandoned looking at alternatives to IVF. So that is most important: is has the couple pursued this restorative approach? The hallmark of a restorative approach is the use of a fertility awareness based method. I mentioned I teach the Billings method. There's many other out there. They're scientifically developed based on biomarkers of the woman's cycle. So that could be cervical mucus, it could be temperature, it could be urinary hormones. There's a number of biomarkers. And what that does is it's a diagnostic tool to see the health of that woman's cycle. And it's used by the restorative reproductive medicine practitioner to time certain blood tests and certain treatments. So instead of taking over the reproductive system and driving everything artificially, it's designed to work cooperatively with the woman's cycle. And so you don't need to use as high doses of stimulatory drugs. You're only trying to get one follicle, not 10 to 20. And there's a number of treatments that can be done that can improve, and then you can tell whether the woman has a healthy ovulation. And then the same thing should be done for men, that they should be very early on, part of the evaluation, and their health matters too, because their health will impact the health of their sperm. And so both of those are done in concert. It is a longer process. It's going to take at least 1 to 2 to more years, because the first thing you have to do is identify the underlying health issues. Then you have to treat the underlying health issues. Once you have healthy ovulation, now you need at least 12 months of attempts to try, right? You have at least 12 tries. And so it takes longer. But even if you don't conceive, you will leave the program in better health than when you arrived, right? You don't leave empty-handed, because it is a therapeutic approach to infertility, not a technological approach that ignores the health of the individual.
That's really good. Well, Dr. Turczynski, thank you so much for sharing your wealth of knowledge with us. I know I learned a lot. I'm sure this gave our audience a lot of things to consider. So thank you so much for your time. Hey, everyone. Welcome to the Them Before Us podcast. This is one of our team Clubhouse staff edition episodes where we're following up our interview with Dr. Craig Turczynski, who was really knowledgeable, really interesting, and he's been involved in this space for such a long time. So I feel like my mind was getting blown just with kind of some of the really, I guess, practical. He was really breaking down just exactly what happens with the IVF process in a way I hadn't heard before. So we hope you all enjoyed it. We're welcoming back Patience and Josh. Hey, everyone.
Man, good job. I was sitting here listening to this one as we've been going through them all, and this guy was fascinating. You guys picked such good guests, so kudos to you both. This has been such an eye-opening experience, just even going through them. As someone that works for them before us, still learning so much.
Yeah, Patience, good job. So many of these folks, I guess we'd kind of been aware of, or maybe Katie had connection with them, but it was really neat to get to speak to each of the different experts kind of in these different aspects of the technology. And so Dr. Turczynski was a reproductive physiologist. He was really prominent in kind of like the first waves of these things happening. I think even as a student, working with animals, working with, I think, he wasn't working like in a zoo or with like exotic animals. I feel like he was more with farm animals. I think he said someone has to travel around and help you get your livestock pregnant. Like was his job at some point. Maybe not the most glamorous work, but then he moved into IVF and was pretty prominent there, but then stepped away because he said he kind of recaptured or came back to his Catholic faith. And so he had a really interesting perspective where he'd experienced all the medical technology or participated in it, but now believes that that's not, where people what people should be doing. So before we get maybe more into the details, sorry, yeah, just share any major thoughts.
I was going to say, one thing that stuck out to me is I feel like in some ways his journey is what a lot of people are going through right now. Because I think faith played an element in it, but this is a really knowledgeable guy, obviously, who got into IVF for the same reason a lot of couples who are very passionate about getting pregnant, having children, get into IVF as well. Is they think, I'm going to be able to start a family, and for him, I'm going to be able to help people start families. And it's only, even for someone like him who knows, I mean, the guy was working on like giraffe embryos. I mean, this is like wild. He's a scientist, knows so much. Even he hit this like pivot point where he began to see, well, wait, we're good at creating embryos. We create lots of them. But are you serious? The 6 excess in scare quotes, we're just getting rid of them? Like, can you even say that about a human being? Like, it was amazing to me that even he, getting into the industry, was unaware of some of the practices. How then can we expect a normal couple who's like buying a minivan, going to soccer practice, like, how can we expect that person to get into this and go, oh yeah, I know exactly what I'm getting into. I know exactly the odds of me having 5 embryos at the end of this process and having to make a life and death decision. And I think that goes back to like the heart behind doing this whole thing. It is not to condemn families. It is not to make people feel bad or make them, say, hey, you have to deal with your infertility. Like, that is never been it. It's been like, even doctors with degrees in this stuff can get into it and not realize the literal ethical implications that they will have to deal with. So I felt like, man, I was going on a journey with him, and it felt like exactly the journey that my wife and I went on when we went through some of this process too.
Hmm. Yeah, and his story of kind of hitting that this far and no further point where he's being told, let these embryos culture until they die. Um, and for him that was such a turning point. And I think, yeah, like you were saying, Josh, that realization of what's happening in the industry and what's happening to these so-called excess embryos, for a lot of people who have started looking into this issue, that becomes their turning point, where they say, oh wait, maybe this isn't the wonderful pro-life industry that we've been believing that it is, just because you know babies equals pro-life. And Dr. Turczynski's story of being in that position where he's told this is what you have to do, which I think also opens a piece that we haven't really dived into as much in this series, but the implications for medical professionals as this industry is expanding. I know medical professionals in my family who have been in situations where they decided not to take a job at a hospital because that hospital practiced abortion, and they didn't want to be in a position where they were ever required as a nurse to assist with that procedure. And I think for a lot of doctors, just even trying to get into the fertility space and to help couples who are struggling with infertility, the that area of medicine is so focused on IVF that I think it does end up pushing out a lot of pro-life doctors, unless if they're able to find, like Dr. Turczynski did, the restorative reproductive medicine approach. So I think that creates a challenge in the industry as well, where there aren't really pro-life voices within the industry because people get to that point and they say, oh, I don't want to be in a position where I'm told that I have to destroy these embryos. And so it becomes an echo chamber of people who don't recognize the humanity of embryos, and they're the ones deciding what the best practices are.
Well, this is like a really good policy piece that we found, again, set the ethical implications aside, but we had this problem that families want to start having children and they've been unable. And they found a workaround that is really good at creating life and is pretty horrific on the back end with some of its, well, we'll freeze them, we'll donate them, all these dehumanizing things. But that has been sufficiently, suppressed, and couples are still taking this first off ramp, and the industry is good at monetizing it. And so we've essentially just diverted all traffic to this first exit instead of it struck me as I was listening. Have we even spent money, time, energy? To what degree have we spent those resources on better solutions? When how much attention our best doctors, our best funding is getting put all into this workaround that's not making women any healthier, that's not
Mhm.
researching any more about cycles or fertility, and we're just going down this one path. I mean, that stood out to me as we were talking.
Yeah, and I believe the statistic like on endometriosis research is $2 per patient per year. Just when you break down the statistics of how many women have endometriosis and how much is actually being spent on research behind, what's causing this and how to best treat it. And I think, yeah, like you said, Josh, it's because we kind of have this one off ramp for people. Here's how you pursue pregnancy regardless of your diagnosis,
And
and people getting ushered into one
do you,
solution.
I was gonna say, do you think that any of this is because people won't like to hear that maybe giving our young women birth control from the minute they start ovulating is a good idea? Like maybe what they'll find is we're causing some of these issues ourselves. That hey, maybe delaying fertility is a bad idea. That maybe you've missed some of your window. Maybe we should be telling women that. Maybe we shouldn't be telling them you can just start birth control and there's absolutely no down the road consequence. I'm like, okay, now was it that we just had a really good first solution and so all the money's getting diverted, or is some of this like also big pharma is not going to love some of the things that we uncover when we start looking at what are the underlying causes of this infertility too?
Mhm.
Well, and it seems, I mean, I have acquaintances or people I know who were starting birth control in their teens because of like acne. Or the stereotype is, as someone who's homeschooled, of public school, of like, you just throw condoms and birth control at kids because they're going to do it anyway. And our culture became so, it's like the free love, the downstream of the sexual revolution is just kind of, well, we don't want there to be abortions, or so it is more pro-life to like just shove birth control at kids so you're preventing something. And so much of this, the ramifications of the technology just have not been considered until we're what, 10, 20, 30 years down the road. But I did want to like throw out a little bit of a thought exercise, because I started to think, from this perspective of a doctor. Let's say you're in college, you're college age, or you're just getting out of residency or whatever. It is pretty incredible to think about these professionals that, especially on the cusp of the technologies. Can you imagine being in a lab and you have this theory that we'll be able to pull an egg out and sperm out and put it in this dish, and we're going to see if this will actually produce a human being? And then just the reality of, look at what we're able to do. I believe every human that comes from it is still under God's will, and all these things, right? It still requires some conscious effort of, I would say, the intelligent designer. But the fact that humans could figure out this technology to make it work in a way that I would say then is not natural. I wonder how many people just got high on, this is incredible, look what we're able to do, like human ingenuity. And then you have people that are ready to make a buck and whatever. But that's the problem. There's people within the industry that really got in because they said, I'm here because I want to help people, and look what we can do. And we've got to harness this to do all this good stuff. And maybe that was his intent, right, at the beginning. And you have the people who are so desperate for children, and children wanting children. It's a good thing. I want kids. This is great. Then we're stuck, though, inside of it with all the ramifications, the implications, the ethical issues. People, we did not think it all through. And so that's a huge piece of what this series is about, is just to, we have to talk about these things. But like Josh, you guys do a great job of just pointing out, we're not calling anyone who was involved or who chose these things or whatever, you're not bad people, we don't think you're evil, all this stuff. But it's so important that we talk about, we understand the underlying goods that maybe brought this stuff about, but we still have to talk about what the reality is for what it's
Well,
causing for people and for human
I,
lives.
I think there's this biblical principle that once you know, you're responsible for the knowledge. And I do think to some degree, I think a lot of couples can be forgiven. I mean, I think they're going to work that out, how they've had to deal with these ethical implications. Again, my family is similar in this regard. My brother and sister were conceived via IVF. So I think what we can't afford to do is to have people live in the dark. I think they need to know, absolutely, going into it. But then I think there's something to all of us in the end going, hey, I was operating. This was what maybe clouded my judgment. This is what I was. And now I'd love to be able to get the story out to more people so that they know what's going on. And maybe I think a great outcome of this would be so that we can push people to research and discover better ways of doing this. Why are we accepting that the only path to creation or family formation when infertility arises is a technology that's going to have a 93% failure rate, which is going to end human lives? Like, we don't have to. I get. This technology seems like God, right? Because we can hide a lot of the consequences, but I want to believe that we can potentially treat more of the underlying conditions and let God's greatest handiwork, which is the human body, do what it's
Mhm.
supposed to do, originally.
I really appreciated that Dr. Turczynski, in the way that he was talking about these issues and some of the ways that he framed things, it's very clear he has a lot of sensitivity towards people who have either gone through IVF or were born via IVF. And he has a lot of compassion towards couples who are struggling with infertility. I think just throughout our conversation, it was very clear that what drew him to IVF in the first place was a desire to help couples. And what drew him out of IVF and into a restorative approach was that continued desire to help couples, and that he's still doing that, and that he still has that heart for helping people to achieve fertility, but also to achieve health and to really address the underlying problems. And I think, that was a really great thing to see. He wasn't just someone who left the industry and he's angry about it and that's why he talks about it. He's someone who left the industry and is pointing people towards something better. And I thought that was something really valuable about our conversation with him.
Well, we can all take away, if someone like him can go through this epiphany himself, having done years of medical school and training. I think there's grace for everyone who feels like, maybe I didn't know when I got into it. Maybe I knew and didn't understand or comprehend, and I'm sitting here now having to make very difficult decisions. Then again, you may be choosing between the best of what you feel like are all terrible choices. I'd say God has a ton of grace in those situations for you. And again, we would love to, you can reach out to our team at Them Before Us as well, to be a resource, to get connected, to talk through it and counsel. But yes, that's one thing I just wanted to keep emphasizing is, this is a process of getting information out, because we do believe that people being educated about how this works is the most important takeaway from these discussions.
Something we say at Them Before Us is that IVF is not curing infertility, it's circumventing it. And I like one of the quotes he said is, quote, "Instead of taking over the reproductive system and driving everything artificially, restorative medicine works with the woman's cycle to optimize fertility naturally," end quote. IVF is not solving the underlying problems of infertility. It's trying to go around it. But we also point out it's often making it worse, because the processes you have to do to be able to access the eggs are actually quite difficult. But this is a kind of a pushback we get often, and I'm curious what either of you or both of you would say to this. A lot of folks are saying this is happening naturally anyway. People are losing just as many fertilized embryos. They just don't implant and they die just as often as IVF. So no, you can't say IVF is not pro-life, because another quote of his is, he said, less than 1 out of every 10 embryos produced in IVF ever becomes a baby. That's not very pro-life. That was a quote from his interview. So what would you say to folks who say, hey, but that's the same in natural processes? That's already happening. So IVF is not different in that way.
I think there's a couple things. So, first of all, it's not about just being a numbers game. The thing is, if an embryo is created inside of a woman's body, then that embryo has a chance at implantation, and that embryo has a chance at developing into a full pregnancy and being born. An embryo that's created in the lab only has that chance if they survive those initial days of being developed in a lab. And so our staff has already talked to Dr. Prentice, who it is going to be in an upcoming episode. But one of the things that he pointed out is that actually that lab process is a major cause of death for embryos. A lot of embryos don't make it just through that. And then there are all these add-ons for IVF as well, with freezing and screening and pre-implant, checking, is this embryo genetically going to be what we're looking for, even sex selection. Those embryos don't have that same chance at life that an embryo created inside of a woman's body has. And also, like I said, this isn't a numbers game, but the sheer volume of embryos created via IVF and lost via IVF actually does outpace what you could naturally create. A couple that's struggling with fertility issues, often she's not ovulating every month. So say she's ovulating, 5 to 10 times per year. And if the couple hits that fertility window every month, they're never traveling during that time, they're never sick, they don't have family commitments come up, they always manage to catch the fertility window. There's only a 1 in 4 chance that fertilization actually happens every time. So, there's a very small chance that they're actually creating an embryo each time. And then for that couple to then lose the same volume of embryos that they would lose via IVF, they'd have to be catching that every time, and it would take 2 years to create the same number of embryos that are created and lost via IVF in the matter of a week. And so it's really not the same, both from the perspective of it's simply not the same because those embryos didn't have the same chance at life. But also, if you are going to play the numbers game, it still doesn't come out the same, where the number of embryos being lost naturally simply doesn't compare to the number of embryos created and destroyed via IVF. There have been over 120 million embryos created via IVF in the US, and 12 million people alive today who were born via IVF.
And patients, tell me, from the best of our data, do we know how many are never even transferred? I know we know kind of how many are total fertilized. We kind of have an estimate, and we know how many are born. But how many are never even, because that's something you brought up, was in natural pregnancy created inside a mother's womb. Every single one gets a woman's best shot at life. The best we know how to incubate a child gets the best every single time. Highest chance. But here, do we know how many aren't even given a chance to be implanted? Do we have any idea on that?
That's a piece of information that the industry doesn't report. So we have pretty minimal information there. There was an article several years ago that suggested that it may be as low as 7% that are transferred. But then the journalist who wrote it was conflating transfer and implantation. So we don't know exactly, but we do know that between 1 and 10 million are currently in storage right now. So those are embryos that survived the lab process, made it to that 3-day or 5-day mark when they get frozen, and then are left in storage. So we don't have an exact number on how many are transferred. That's actually a piece of information that we would really like to see the CDC tracking, because the industry should be held accountable on that. And also because couples should have that information. What are the statistics? What are the odds that the embryo that I create will actually have a chance at implantation inside my womb? And that's a piece of information that couples don't have because the industry is not reporting it, and the CDC is not requiring reporting on that.
You said between 1 and 10 million on ICE, right? Doesn't that just
Yeah.
show too how bad the data is, or just like how it is fascinating to me how little they're required to show for what they're doing. How many are graded and discarded? That'd be really nice to know, things like that. And I guess the people that say this is all about helping people and it is pro-life. And it's like, well, then wouldn't you be on board with getting some good data and people being, or, the industry being required to just report what's happening? Don't even say they have to regulate it or whatever, but they have to tell people what's happening. So I think people don't want to know the human cost.
I think the biggest indicator of that was when Alabama Supreme Court came down and said that the woman that wandered into a random freezer, dropped 2 vials, killed all these embryos. They said, this is wrongful death, that these embryos were life, and at least you're liable for paying the families. And the response from the IVF industry, which again, the medical doctors, hospitals, they deal with death every day. They do risky procedures. They continue to operate, even though they're saying, hey, we're doing our best to preserve life here. These industries said, we can no longer operate if we have to treat these embryos as life. Well, that's telling on themselves. I mean, for me, that's just if your business model depends on the embryos not being treated as life, then this is that we should be questioning the business model of this industry.
Yeah, that's well said. Well, hey, this has been a great conversation. I hope all of you enjoyed this interview, enjoyed our little wrap up. We'd love to hear just your thoughts. You can comment, you can email us at thembeforeus.com with any feedback or questions, things we could talk about more in future episodes. Hope you're enjoying the IVF series. Thanks so much for listening, and thank you for joining the Them Before Us movement.